Yeah, we have in that area too, there's the nurses managers that works a lot with like voluntary conservation actions and then we have our district. Hillary do those. I think that's great. Hillary do those. Good, another good contact.
All right, so it's time. Welcome everyone. This is the 5th meeting of the Technical Working Group supporting the Farm and Forest Conservation Program in Project. And very excited to have you all here today. So a couple housekeeping before we get started. These meetings are a combination of in-line and on-person. So again, if you're online and you're having any technical issues, please go ahead and text or email or call Angela Williamson, our administrative support for this project. Her contact information is on the agenda that is posted for today's meeting. If you're in the room, just raise your hand or whatever, and I'll do my best to try to make sure everybody gets called on and we have a good conversation. So these meetings are being recorded and posted to our website, and they're also being live streamed for folks who are following this process along online. And while these conversations are limited to members of the technical working group, we're still very interested in hearing from the public who's following along. So please don't hesitate to send your comments or thoughts to me at hillary.foot@dlcd.oregon.gov. My email address is on the project webpage as well as on the agenda for these meetings. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started with introductions so everyone knows who we are. So I'll go ahead and we'll start in the room. I am Hillary Foot, and I am the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And also in the room, we have Angela, who is supporting this project.
I'm Angela Williamson. If you have any questions or technical issues, please reach out.
And Jim.
Hi, everyone. Jim Johnson, Oregon Department of Agriculture.
And here we have Joy with us today.
Hi everyone, Joy Vaughn, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
And Mike.
Mike McCarthy, McCarthy Family Farm, Parkdale, Oregon.
And then online, Sarah, would you introduce yourself?
I'm just figuring out my buttons here. There we go.
Come on, Sarah, you're an IS person.
Hi, I am Sarah Marvin. I'm the Measure 3749 specialist at DLCD. And in my former lives, I've used GIS a lot. I've done lots of studies with GIS, so I sort of inadvertently became an expert in that too. So maybe not expert, but.
All right, great. And Dan.
Yeah, hello, my name is Dan Hubner. I'm a GIS analyst with the Oregon Department of Forestry in the Planning and Analysis section. And my work particularly focuses on tracking long-term land use change in the state.
And John?
John DeKarzik. I work with Dan in the Oregon Department of Forestry. For some reason, my video does not show up, and I don't know why. And it's confounding to me. But
we see you.
That's crazy. And also kind of disconcerting, to be honest. But that's great.
Can't see the forester from the trees.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's funny because this is the only platform that it seems like that's happened before. Regardless, Oregon Department of Forestry and Dan and focus on a variety of resource and land intersection interests and concerns. So happy to be here.
And Lori, did you want to introduce yourself?
Lori from Landwatch Lane County. And I noticed in the view, if you click on the 3 little dots and then you get the view, there's a one of the things lets you look at yourself. It's like a toggle. So maybe the reason that the person who couldn't see themselves, that toggle might be toggled the wrong way.
It was toggled the wrong way. Thank you for pointing that out. And it's toggled the right way. I'm now grounded. Thank you very much, Lori.
You're welcome.
And Jackie, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jackie Dyke Jones. I'm a farmer in Washington County, raising blackberries, blueberries, and grass seed mostly. So looking forward to today.
And for Washington County today, we have Stephen Shane with us. Maitri, unfortunately, is out sick.
That is true. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Shane. I've been with the county for about 16 years, both in long range and current planning. I'm currently the principal planner for development review. And yeah, just sitting in for Maitri and mostly observing. Good to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
And Gail.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gail Henriksen with Clatsop County.
And Jennifer.
I'm Jennifer Hughes. I'm the planning director for Clackamas County.
And Nellie.
Hi, everyone. Nellie McAdams, Executive Director of Oregon Agricultural Trust.
And Ian.
Hi there, Ian Sisson, Senior Planner for Clatsop County.
And Christian.
Hi, thank you. Christian Richmond. I manage Filbert Orchards in Yamhill, Polk, and Clackamas County.
And Blair.
Hi, I'm Blair Batson, Staff Attorney with 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Great. Glad you're able to join us today. So again, if you missed this meeting or any of the past meetings, these meetings are recorded and they're available to view online, and we'd still love to hear your thoughts if you can't join us today. All right, so a reminder, today we're going to talk about a wide variety of topics. And the common thread, again, with this project is looking at issues with the farm and forest program that, if addressed, would really improve implementation of those programs in terms of consistency, clarity, and in line with the intent, the policy intent of the goals. We have identified a ton of issues so far, and we'll get to that in the wrap up later on today. But there are definitely a few more to touch on. So why don't we go ahead and get that conversation started. So the first thing we wanted to touch on today is a theme that's been coming up throughout these conversations, and that is data collection, data availability, analyses. And what I'm really interested in today, particularly, are your thoughts on needed analyses. So we've talked about, in this process, sort of requests to visualize the geographic distribution of non-resource permit approvals. I think there was a request to provide mapping for high-value farmland. There was interest in TLCD maybe supporting counties in doing material stability analyses. There are, of course, conversations about cumulative impacts and visualizing conversion. So there are a lot of different things raised that touch on this topic and these issues. So a theme underlying all of that is that while we do have, DLCD does have a lot of data in a database and in spreadsheets, we do not have dedicated GIS resources. So like, for example, for the Farm and Forest Report, I do my own GIS work, my own mapping. If it's something that's complicated, I will rope in our Measure 49 specialist or one of the urban planners to help out. So when we receive requests from a county, for example, Clatsop had asked for feedback on a proposed GIS methodology for aligning, the rectangle for template test reviews along the road. And so without, internal GIS resources, I was pinging a number of different GIS users within the agency, but we don't have a department. And we do get requests from the public. I think Nellie had a couple of data or review requests. And, you know, we actually do have as 1,000 Friends has pointed out, a statutory obligation to provide a certain degree of mapping support. So in these conversations, I think what would be helpful really to Sarah and I is to be able to articulate that list of use cases coming in from members of this working group. That would help define the need for DLCD provided mapping resources and GIS analysis support out there. And with that list, now we can think more internally about how we would propose filling those requests. So I touched on a couple of the topics that we identified, but I'd like to hear more from you all about that. So Nellie or others out there, if you have comments about sort of analyses that you'd like to see that maybe we haven't touched on or covered, or thoughts on use cases, I think it would be great to hear them. And Jackie, you raised your hand.
Yeah, my first thought is even the current DLCD map viewer, I have said in multiple testimonies, or even speaking with Governor Kotek the other day about protecting farmland and using lands inside the UGBs, that people aren't even viewing the resource that's here. So my concern is, number one, the inventory is being asked for and needed, but then the next step is for people to use it and utilize it for the efficient decision making. So that's an observation that I wanted to share.
So if I were to rephrase that any mapping resources like are using the Oregon Explorer platform, is that what we're using? So any mapping resources developed would need to come with some public outreach component to let people know that existed and was available as a tool.
Correct, because especially if Department of Ag is going to be kept out of state capital as experts or things like that, we need people to still use it as the data and facts, not just skimming over it.
Okay, thank you. And Nellie?
Yeah, I think as like a precursor, just having the data located and having consistency between counties would be big. I just remember from Nick Chen's report that he wrote on conditional uses, that I mean, not only was it difficult to identify those uses, but it was difficult to have some kind of consistent program between counties. So to the extent that counties can be supported also in being a partner in that, so that it's not all at DLCD, I think that would be helpful. And then thinking about how that's parsed and how that is searchable is certainly important, but just simply having clean data is doesn't seem to be where we're at right now.
Thank you. Yeah, I know Sarah knows all about the data cleaning and efforts, and that is something that you're right. It is very important to make sure that the data that we are collecting from counties and other sort of regional entities is consistent and is correctly interpreted. Blair and then Ian.
Could I ask one quick question?
Yeah, Sarah.
Continue. Could people be more explicit in what data sets they're talking about so I can write them down? Thank you.
So Blair?
Thank you. So we talked about this some at the beginning of our meetings, but just want to kind of go over really the first three items that you have on this week's matrix. Hillary, to me, kind of are the priorities. So really the top of that is we need to get funding so that DLCD has its own GIS capability. And I think the director is very supportive of that, having come from the department, the water department, where there's, exuberant capability, it's kind of crazy that the state land agency doesn't really have adequate mapping. So I think that's something we can't do ourselves, but I think there should be a very strong recommendation that it's a super high priority for the agency. The two other issues are one that we talked about when we were talking about the farm impacts test. And Nellie just referenced Nick Chung's report. So I think this is number one, is kind of where you're getting at this, but no, actually, or maybe number two. But I guess, no, number five, sorry about that. That really, you have the capability, you have the data in your farm forest reports that you receive from the county about all the approvals of farm and non-farm uses, forest and non-forest uses, going back quite some time. And there's also some data before that regarding uses that were existing before that. So I think rather than spending a ton of time on methodology, I mean, methodology is important, but I think there's a pressing need if those resources can be garnered to start mapping it. Because I think all these other discussions that we've had in terms of farm impact, stability standard, it's very difficult. I mean, to ask a county to do it on a case-by-case basis with each applications, it's just too much to ask. It's just too hard and expensive. So to get that in a centralized database, and maybe, of course, it's going to be counties that are prioritized because they have the greatest population pressure on their resources. But we don't need to delay on this. And I'm concerned because there's a lot of rulemaking and a lot of great issues that we're addressing throughout this matrix. But this seems to be top priority, particularly to discuss the improvements to the program that we've been discussing in this working group. And the second part is related, which you referenced the ODFW and also, mostly ODFW criteria for priority wildlife areas. We talked about in an earlier group that there's now mapping of critical groundwater areas. We know that there are these high-risk fire areas. It seems that super high priority, again, along with mapping the uses and the resource zones, are getting those maps incorporated in a way that counties have them available in their comprehensive plans so that when applications come up, when all kinds of proposals come up, they know where these areas are. Because I think they're very much guide where we will want to and not want to have additional development. That's
so
all.
If I were to sort of sum that up, a super high priority in addition to having supporting a GIS program within DLCD would be just getting those non-resource approvals mapped and visualized spatially. So right now we have the ability to do that at the section level, but not smaller. But that's something that we're looking at. And then maybe DLCD providing guidance on some of these critical data sets that other agencies are producing. That would be important for counties to be aware of and to consider in updates to various elements of their comprehensive plans. Is that?
Yes, and if we ever got back to funding periodic review properly, they would have that available. I mean, it should be incorporated in their comprehensive plans, but it's a matter of cost, just so it's available to them. So there's not just a guidance document, but anybody, any citizen, any county official can look at the map and know where these things are.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian and then Nellie.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Blair said a lot of what I wanted to say as from a staff perspective. I mean, in Clatsop County, first of all, we don't get very many applications where we have to do like a cumulative impacts analysis. But if and when we do, it can be really cumbersome to find the information we need and to understand the methodology. And so I totally agree to have a centralized place where we can find the data that we need, like a data clearinghouse type thing, and then some guidance documents to know what to do with that data, how to use it, that are based on the rules and statutes and probably even case law, as much as that's possible. And then that way we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time one of these things comes up. And then things would also be more consistent from county to county. And like we and probably most other counties do have in-house GIS where, you know, as long as they know where to find the data and we have some technical guidelines from the department, then, you know, we can crunch it and get the output that we need for whatever case we might be working on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Nellie and then Mike and then Jim. All right. Well, thank you, Ian. Nellie?
This is more goal 9 than goal 3, but I do just want to put a pin in having a comprehensive database of industrial lands, because I know that that does not exist. And that creates definitely opportunity costs for agricultural land.
Thank you. I know that is something that's been brought up in other areas as well, as the industrial lands mapping piece. All right, so Mike?
Yeah, in Hood River County, what we're seeing is really a landslide of commercial activities in conjunction with wineries, cideries, breweries. Would be really helpful if we had that mapped in some manner. I think personally, we're at the point where it's really creating instability in the farm area. I don't know what the case law is around that. I wish there was some detail there. Also, hardship and replacement dwellings. I think it would be, I don't know whether we need to map them, but certainly the data of where they are and how many there are in a county. We have a lot of those that never go away and are probably being used. And of course, that's a difficult conversation now with the housing shortage, but nevertheless, they did sign off that they would remove them and not use them, and they're being used. The other issue in Hood River County is we have a lot of very good big game habitat. It's not mapped. It's very limited what's mapped in Hood River County. So I think we really need to update that mapping also. And then we need at some point some real clear standards of what destabilizing the farm zone means and how you test for that.
So again, I'm hearing from you another plug for mapping some of those non-resource uses, particularly dwellings that are meant to be removed, like the hardship dwellings and those replacement dwellings that were as intended to be converted, like were removed. And Jim.
Okay, I'm gonna build off of a lot of what's already been said, but it relates to a lot of the phone calls and questions that I get, and it especially comes out of energy facility siting related on farmland, but it could be applicable to a lot of other things. You know, we've heard a lot about need for certain inventories and the like. A great example is Fish and Wildlife Commission has, you know, mapped conservation areas and the like, or whatever. And it's great to have that data, but it's not applicable until it's put into a comprehensive plan. And counties are not going to do that politically in some cases because it's going to do added restrictions. I think because a lot of this occurs on farmland, I do get these calls and the like, and I think the commission's going to have to think long term if they're not going to get periodic review going again, considering requiring direct application of things like conservation areas adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Commission, groundwater limited areas and those maps and having restrictions associated with that, groundwater quality areas. You know, we've got issues over in Morrow County and Umatilla County with not only limited water supply, but water quality related to things. And that's going to impact agriculture, but I'm going to be the first to admit that it's problematic. Wildfire, of course, and a lot of these resources are not going to be put into county comprehensive plans unless either periodic review is required again, or the commission requires direct application. And there is precedent of the commission requiring direct application by a county of something that they haven't adopted. You know, soil surveys are a great example. I wanted to also talk about the cumulative impacts issue because I get calls from the Department of Energy all the time asking me to help them to do the cumulative impacts analysis and the like. And this is not just a mapping issue. We've already talked about this a little bit, but it's also a process issue. I think the more we can do to help the counties to understand what is the process to do the cumulative impact analysis, the study area, the issues that we're looking at. I think we need to be really, much more clear about that. And I've got to give the Department of Energy a lot of credit. They are very good at coordinating with other state agencies and other local governments to do that. And I think we need to see more of that across the board. And lastly, I just think there needs to be some more education for the counties, for the general public, for land people interested in land use in terms of how to use the Web Soil Survey. How to use the Oregon Explorer. I don't know how many times people have asked me, where did I get that data? And I'll say, well, I got it from the Web Soil Survey. Well, people know how to use the Web Soil Survey in terms of going on there and finding the soils type and maybe finding the capability class, but there's so much more information in there that's readily available. National Crop Commodity Production Index, which in some ways someday may replace capability classes, the way to measure the value of ag land. A lot of people don't even know that exists, but it's right there in the Web Soil Survey. Hydric soils are in the Web Soil Survey. I mean, you know, that's a pretty basic element, but people don't even know that if you click on this button after you found the soils type, you can find out the, you know, so there needs to be some education there. And I know that my colleagues at the NRCS would be more than happy to teach a class on that, for example. I mean, they're the ones that taught me how to use it.
So maybe something like asking Jericho or Steve to do a webinar for counties on.
Sure. Or even an advanced workshop, you know, 10 people come in at a time and bring their laptop with them and they hook to the Wi-Fi and they're all looking at the same maps, and like that's the best way to learn, as opposed to sitting on a webinar and somebody describing you how to do it. If you're also doing it at the same time, you're going to remember it. So, and I hope Dan's going to, you know, Dan's got his hand up, but I wanted to say, Dan, the last thing I want to say is we need to continue to financially support the Department of Forestry in their work and the people, farms, I always forget the name, but that report has been one of the best things to happen to land use planning in my career. It is an objective approach to looking at the changes in rural landscapes, and it's not just about forest, it's about agriculture, it's about rural residential, and it is my go-to report now when I'm talking about the cumulative impacts of conversion of rural lands. So we need to really stay behind and support that. And I'm glad that we've got some new people at Forestry working on that. I mean, you know, Gary Lettman's still out there someplace, but I haven't seen him in a long, long time. So, you know.
That is a great segue and intro, Dan, to whatever you want to say now. Yeah.
No, yeah, I just wanted to really echo what Jim was saying on the Gulf Forest land side too, in terms of like, it would be really valuable to have training on using the NRCS Web Soil Survey stuff, because in the existing rules it, you know, calls out use NRCS as the #1 go-to data source when you're, you know, assessing a zone change request, but there's a lot of detail in how you can go about doing that assessment, and that's not specified at all in the current rules, or even I think in the older ODF guidance document that was supporting that. So I think it would be helpful for counties, applicants, everybody to just have laid out in more detail specifically how you should go about making those determinations with the NRCS Web Soil Survey.
I think it's a great idea. Because I certainly, yes, I'm aware that it's difficult for folks to figure out, well, which state do you use, and like which tree type do I use?
There's only 400 tabs to click on that.
All right, great. So it sounds like maybe some collaboration for a webinar.
Hillary, and reiterate the comment relative to the reporting, and Jim, it's well funded. It's not going anywhere. It's going to maintain, persist, and only improve.
Don't say that. You get some more money, and we can even do more things.
That's exactly was my thinking as well. So
it is a great, very consistent data set, and Sarah and I have been working with Dan on looking at.
It's especially important since the federal National Resource Inventory, the NRI, has gotten to be very gross now. It's very general, where the NRI, when Ron Eber and I first started working with it, 25 years ago, we were overlaying urban growth boundaries with it. We were overlaying all, and we could actually see planned loss versus, unplanned loss and the like. Well, the NRI that the feds do now is just not set up to be able to do that anymore. So that's why it's even more important for us to be able to use the Department of Forestry's data to do those same types of analyses.
Good to hear.
So I want to touch really quickly in this on sort of we've heard about periodic review updates, and we've heard a little bit more about cumulative impact. One of the suggestions was providing guidance for counties on the sort of analysis that might benefit a goal 3 or goal 4 update when counties do that voluntarily, like Clatsop did not too long ago. Ian, did you want to offer anything on that particular point, what that experience was like for you, or what kind of guidance would have been very helpful to have from the agency in embarking upon that, or Gail?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, one of the things that we found when we were working on goal 3 is that people looked at agricultural land as more than just EFU. And so there were, we have a lot of EFU, but a lot of our actual farming operations are occurring on small rural residential lands that are zoned for residential and agriculture. And so they were bringing in a lot of topics. And I know that when we sent it off for a courtesy review to DLCD, and we also sent it off to legal counsel, we got a lot of comments back on that. And so I think guidance about what is appropriate to be included or should be addressed or needs to be addressed, but also maybe consider the possibility that farming activities are going to occur on lands that are not EFU, and maybe a separate set of guidelines to help address some of those issues, I think would have been really helpful for us.
And one of the things I think that came up also during your process, which was a little bit before I started, so I'm heard some of the feedback on it, was the tension of the understanding of what the program does encompass, that it's a conservation program and that DLCD and the counties do not regulate farm practices or forest practices. As I recall, that came up in your goal forward update as well as a topic. So one of the items on this list, and that's pertinent to the next discussion as well on sort of climate considerations, is to provide a guidance document for counties on the types of things to consider, how you might look at the historic development in a county, the cumulative impacts in the county, and then what flexibility counties have in implementing the goal 3 and goal 4 programs, particularly around the sub 2 uses, where they could look at those patterns of historical development, impacts on agricultural and timber economies, and then the types of actions that they could take to sort of address that in implementing changes in ordinance. So that was sort of the idea behind that particular item. So any other comments on that point? No. Okay. So some of the folks who were particularly interested in this are not on the call today, but we wanted to touch on climate adaptation and mitigation. So as I just mentioned, DLCD does not regulate, and we do not incentivize farm practices or forest practices. Those are in the purview of our sister agencies. So we maintain a conservation program that limits allowable development on lands that are important to the agricultural and timber economies. That's what we do. So in finding our place in the climate conversation for goals 3 and goal 4, we have focused on highlighting the importance of maintaining the integrity of the existing farm and forest conservation program. And that's the work that we're doing right now, is identifying issues with the program and how to strengthen it and improve its implementation across the state. So the Oregon Global Warming Commission has a natural working lands subgroup that's been looking at the value of sequestration in the climate conversation, particularly on our working lands, farm and forest lands, and other natural resource lands. And in their initial report and then most recent report, they've called for the enhancement and the maintenance of the conservation aspects of the land use planning program. So that's sort of in line with what sort of we've been trying to highlight in the conversation. So then the recent report, they actually state that none of the practices that are identified for increasing carbon sequestration or reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are listed as recommendations in that report would be possible without a land base on which to implement them. So that is something that we're focusing on, getting that message out there. So the commission, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, has also identified in that, they've also called for limiting provisions in the land use planning program that allow for the conversion of natural and working lands to non-resource related uses when they increase emissions, decrease sequestration potential, or create conflicts for resource use of neighboring lands. So that's in the report. And on that particular topic, there have been a couple of suggestions from working group members on how that might be implemented into our rules. So one way is that we can consider adjusting our exception criteria to make it explicit that when you're requesting an exception for a use that's not allowed under Goal 3 or Goal 4, or when you're requesting an exception to convert the working lands essentially to non-resource designation, that the applicant must consider and the jurisdiction must provide findings addressing increase in emissions, decrease in sequestration potential, and those conflicts. Some of those are already captured, but there could be more of an explicit call out on those. I think, Blair, did you have any something else to add on that topic? I think you had some other comments on that.
No, I'm not really sure what that group is saying other than what you've said, but it seems to me that it's sort of obvious that low density rural residential development is not consistent with those goals of carbon sequestration and reducing GHG emissions. So it just seems that, I don't know if we're going to completely revamp goals 3 and 4 to incorporate climate considerations. That's kind of a big lift and may not be appropriate. I just don't know. I haven't thought about it. But it does seem that there can be a policy statement that these working lands are beneficial, right? And keeping them in farm and forest production is beneficial to the climate objectives. And yeah, but I think your idea of any rezoning, anytime you're converting ag land or forest land to a non-resource use and increasing density, you're taking land, you're removing land from the land base that was formerly contributing to carbon sequestration and reduction of emissions. So that, I just think that could be acknowledged, and it could be worked into the policies, as well.
So, suggesting potentially a legislative concept to add an additional statement to 215-243 or some other avenue.
Now, I meant LCDC rule. We're only talking about LCDC. Well, we're not only talking about LCDC.
Well, a goal amendment could define agriculture and forest land to include some of those elements, for example.
Right. Or an interpretive rule as well.
Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, as you know, I was on the stakeholder advisory committee, and you summarized very well what we put into the plan. Greg Holmes of Thousand Friends and I worked on that to make sure that the first thing in the forestry and the farmland sections was that you have to protect the land before you can do anything with it. One thing that I did not bring up in that group, and is a very hard conversation to have with people, is that, and I'm going to cite a study that was done in England, that 27% of global emissions, greenhouse emissions in England are from a category called recreation and leisure. And 24% are from the food system, which includes growing the crop until you dispose of the garbage and wash the dishes. It's not just the farming part. So this category of recreation and leisure is probably the hugest greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. And certainly it is in Hood River County. And every time we make a decision where we have more agritourism, we bring more people out from Portland, and it has a huge negative impact. And I think it should be brought into each one of those decisions. Is it going to increase greenhouse gas emissions more than any sequestration or whatever? So I think it's important. Part of the program, also in promoting the program for the future, I think this is one of its hugest benefits, that we have this huge ag land and forest land that has huge potential for carbon sequestration. So,
well, thank you for volunteering to volunteer on so many different efforts around the strait. But I agree. So, were there other thoughts, Joy?
Yeah.
I
am thinking about what you were saying of the need to protect. I think we can all agree with that. But I think it's where to protect comes up a lot of like, well, where do we prioritize, and how do we make sure that we're doing both? Like we're acknowledging it, but then also, which I think comes back to the mapping. Of what are obviously protecting everywhere, but where are maybe areas that have, because if it's natural and working lands, like from ODFW's perspective, well, where can we have somewhere there are these co-benefits of providing, working lands, but then also some opportunity for conservation of wildlife habitat, for example, and, or corridors. And so I think just somehow thinking about, the where and the how. So acknowledging is one, but how to do it. And I think that report, that's a great effort. And I think just the implementation of it will be really important to further for DLCD, but everywhere else. So
so the implementation of that is it's still, even though it's been going on for a long time, it feels like it's just kind of getting going to me, at least, those conversations. And so that report also calls out as a practice the conservation of rangeland and forest lands. And so, like Joyce said, I think it's really interesting to sort of explore maybe among the agencies, like where are those high value rangelands, high value forest lands, and when I say high value, I mean for climate adaptation and mitigation or sequestration potential. So that's a conversation I think that's identified in the matrix as sort of an ongoing effort at this point in time. All right, Temio, it looks like you're raising your hand.
Yes, I think it's really important when you look at climate-related issues and Oregon land use planning policies, we don't articulate climate-related issues, and they're extremely important, especially in our working lands, agriculture and forestry. When I look at forestry in Lane County, and I've lived on 40 acres for 54 years, and when I look at Beverly Law and also William Moomaw, they have articulated scientific information that indicates carbon sequestration and forest landscapes in Lane County are the highest in the world per acre. Not total landscape, but per acre. That is the kind of high value articulation that land use planning has to recognize. That's different if I'm in the Eastern Cascade areas. But if I'm in that Lane County area, I'm in one of those areas where I sequester more carbon per acre than any place in the world, bar none. And so we don't recognize that. And I think that we need to. And there are other kinds of nuances with older forestry. My particular forestry is the median age is 80, 2 to 3% in its 90s, 1% over 100. We are looking at carbon sequestration, but it is, when I look at land use planning and I look at the general policies that govern timber management, most of it is geared for 40 to 45 years and harvest and a replanting. it seems to me that that flies in the face of good carbon planning for sequestration and storage of climate-related issues. So I wanted to get that out.
Thank you, Artemio. So we have as an action item to convene a technical stakeholder group that will certainly be heavily dependent on feedback from the Department of Forestry to look at the forest lands definition. And I think, we will also have these continuing conversations with our sister agencies, how, we are going to be working with the recommendations that are coming from the Oregon Global Warming Commission and the Natural Working Lands subgroup on, how to move forward with sort of programmatic implementation of that work. John, did you have something to add?
Just a brief comment. The explicit nature of sequestration opportunity is obviously very, very consistent with forest land, which is an active conversation. And I'd applaud Artemio's 80-year average for maximizing that sequestration opportunity and beyond. It's as with respect to the natural working lands conversation, I just teeing off of the data conversation, the agency in coordination with the Forest FIA and several other states has developed a fairly robust dynamic carbon tracking on forest lands, which the Forest Ecosystem Carbon Report, which has been updated on according with FIA, which is the Forest Inventory Analysis Program. It periodically, but is moving to an annual and is supporting going into that natural working lands conversation as they build out their parameters. This is all roundabout to the point that I had, which was the conversation regarding where exceptions occur and the considerations of the carbon implications is very compelling and very consistent with, I think, a lot of overarching ambitions, and also but also taking into consideration Joy's comment relative to the multifaceted benefits that those resources provide. So those are really keen points, and I'm thinking in particular too of some of our previous conversations around energy and cumulative nature. So all would be really it's a compelling vein to explore, especially in consistency with the Global Warming Commission and the work that they're doing, but also a potentially challenging space. Given well, and I heard LC and then the comment, I was like, oh, that would be a pretty good conversation to have.
It would indeed. All right, thank you for that, John. So I want to move into the next topic now, which is it deals with mixed farm forest zones. So
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Lori. I don't have a hand, so I try to put my hand up in the screen.
Sorry, Lori. Yeah.
That's okay. I still can't find a virtual hand. I was a little confused about Artemio's comments, living in Lane County and doing the work I do. Unfortunately, land use has nothing to do with trees. There's nothing that the land use program requires on forest land with regard to protecting the actual trees. So the Department of Forestry, we expect a clear-cut Department of Forestry requires 3 years for replanting, 5 years free to grow. But there's no minimum size for development that the state regulates, and Lane County has no minimum size for development in any zone whatsoever. And what happens in Lane County is on forest land is the developers go in, they do their clear cutting, they don't do the replanting. They put in the roads and the driveways and excavate steep slopes to make their flattest development area. And then they say later that that they meet the criteria after they've manipulated the landscape. And so I would suggest that if we really wanted our forest lands to be used not just for forest use, but to the job of sequestering carbon, there should be a minimum size for development regulated by the state, so that you can't have a 2.5 acre forest land parcel that's completely consumed with driveways, roads, a McMansion, a shed, a garage, and a guest house. And so I am just a little bit confused because I don't see that there's anything right now that the land use program can do with regards to protecting forest land for its carbon sequestration purposes.
Right, Laurie. So you're right. So we don't regulate forest practices, right? That falls to our friends at the Department of Forestry. What we do regulate are development opportunities. And so, you know, what we have control over are how lands that are protected under Goal 4, under forest zoning, are developed for other uses. Right? So for residential use being the most common thing that we see in forest zones, right? And then for non-residential uses, home occupations being the other most common thing that we see in forest zones, usually for some sort of hospitality-oriented use. And so the standards and limitations that we apply to uses that are permitted, these sort of non-resource uses that are permitted in forest zones, are the way that we can sort of limit development and keep those lands available for carbon sequestering practices, whatever those are in the future. So what we're doing now to sort of tighten standards, you know, with forest zones and with farm zones, we'll have that sort of added benefit, maintaining the integrity of the program to conserve those lands. So again, without that land base, you don't have a land base to implement practices on. I guess that's a message that we want to make sure is clear, that the land use planning program, the farm and forest conservation programs are very valuable in this conversation because they protect the lands, or are meant to protect those lands for working land uses. All right, let's move into mixed farm forest zones. So this is another very technical issue. So mixed farm forest zones are zones that have such a mixture of agriculture and forest uses that neither Goal 3 nor Goal 4 can be applied of them. And there's a mixed farm forest designation on it. And then there's a section of rule under Division 6, which are the forest rules that talk about uses and dwellings that are permissible on lands that are zoned for mixed farm forest use. It's pretty short. And it essentially says that uses in exclusive farm use zones and uses that are authorized in our Division 6 forest rules are permissible, or they can be allowed in mixed farm forest zones. And that's it. And when I was at Tillamook County, our mixed farm forest ordinance essentially was that section of rule verbatim. So that section of rule was adopted before a couple of big uses were established that have different standards for farm and forest zones. So youth camps or solar farms are 2 examples. So there's different standards for youth camps in forest zones than there are in farm zones. There's different standards for solar projects or power generating facilities in forest zones than there are in farm zones. And it's unclear whether that section of rule means that all of the uses are allowable, and it's up to counties to determine which ones they want to allow. It's unclear if that means that the more restrictive are permissible. And there's actually been a recent case in Marion County that put a spotlight on this issue. So one part of the question is, what does it mean? So does it mean that, counties are meant to pick which uses and which standards are applicable and clarify it in their ordinance? That's something that LCDC should take up and address. There's another slight nuance and twist to this that came up in the Marion County case that I'll get to, but I want to talk about that first. I can't remember which county brought this up, but was it you, Jennifer? Yeah, okay. Do you want to add some comments on this question?
I mean, I think you captured it. You and I had an email exchange about it, and it's funny because we've had a mixed farm and forest zone on the books since 95-ish, maybe it was even 94. And I just kind of had this revelation very recently and thought, well, this is weird because our ag forest zone doesn't talk about high value farmland versus we don't have that soil distinction. We just say you get your dwellings, of course, based on predominant use, which is clear in the rules.
Sure.
And we've always, enforced that, applied that. But for all those other uses, I've just always kind of thought, well, why isn't there a predominant use test? Although at that point, why would you even need a mixed? I mean, you start to wonder why there's a mixed farm and forest zone at all. But
exactly,
yeah,
it's like if it's predominant use, then just zone it that way. So anyway, but it occurred to me not that long ago because of some question the staff brought that it was like, well, wait a minute. Not only do we not say what you do if the standards are different between farm and forest, but how's the high value farmland play in an ag forest zone? And I mean, I shouldn't admit this, but the reality is our code doesn't say that the high value designation has any significance at all in ag forest. And so that's when I reached out to you and we had that email exchange. And I guess what I would ask for is clarity. We've talked about what the state thinks it means, but it would be wonderful if it just explicitly said that, because then we can easily apply it and we don't have the arguments with customers and questions about what it all means.
And so there are a number of counties out there that just in practice look at predominance for determining which set of standards apply, but there may not be the language to fall back on.
Jennifer said something that I've thought for years and years and years, going back to my days as a county planner, and that is how many farm forest zones across the state are legitimate mixed farm forest zones. And here's my thinking on this. Most farms have some portion of their farm, especially outside the Willamette Valley or on the valley floor, that have forested areas, woodlot and the like. That's just part of farm use. Just because you've got some forest land in a larger farm area doesn't make it mixed farm forest. In fact, in some ways, and I'm just thinking out loud here, so I'm going to be way off, but in some ways, to me, the only legitimate farm forest zones in the state are on the east side, where they're grazing forest land. It's rangeland within forest land in like Union County or something like that. You go to west side of the mountains, it's either farm or forest. It just happens to have a little bit of the other use mixed into it, and that's why the predominance test is so important. I mean, Mike's an orchardist. He's planting perennial, so he takes forest land out, to put that in. But on his farm, there are forested parts of it, but he's zoned EFU. He's not zoned mixed farm forest. And that's really how it works in most cases. You're one or the other with a little bit of the other use. And the mixed farm forest zone in some ways is a cop-out to making the real decision on what is the predominant land use activity in a larger block of land. And remember, we're protecting large blocks of ag land and the like.
So in Clatsop, have you run into this issue or how does your code treat mixed farm forest zones?
I don't know what Ian might want to say, but we don't address the high value farmland as far as I recall. And we just rely on the predominant use of the 1993 date.
Okay, for uses as well as dwellings. So I think it'd be really interesting to do a survey and, you know, get feedback on what counties actually do in permitting uses and take this to LCDC for clarification.
You know, it's interesting when you look at the
Yeah.
definition of farm use in 215-203, it includes woodlots as part of what is farm use. So yeah.
All right. And for folks, the definition of high value farmland applies to EFU, mixed farm forest, and forest. And so there's this Marion County case, very interesting, recently determined that the high value standards applied on forest lands, because that forest land met the soils-based definition of high value farmland. So the second part of that question is what are the implications of LCDC's use limitations on high value farmlands on lands that are in other zones? So Blair, I don't know if you worked on that case or if that was Wendy or somebody else, but did you just raise your hand?
No, but I was thinking about just generally how these work. And I remember going through periodic review in Yamhill County, and I wish that the Washington County planner was still on, because I think they were sort of similar, but the mixed farm forest zone ended up being a zone that had lower lower minimum lot sizes and easier standards. So it was always like, let's see what will allow more non-resource use, the farm zoning or the farm zoning, we're going to opt for that. And that's a very cynical way of saying it, but it kind of seemed to go that way. I think it's worth in your review to kind of see if that's what's happening, but just guidance. I mean, I agree. I think it'd be marvelous to just have farm zones and forest zones, as Jim has suggested. But in the meantime, there's a lot of land in these mixed zones, and to get clarity, like Jennifer said, just, so the counties know what to do and don't have to make a choice every time. And even the predominant standard just seems silly, because again, it gets it back to case by case, and we're trying to do zoning.
Jennifer?
Yeah, just one other comment from our experience. We haven't seen a lot of this, but by having that mixed farm and forest zone, we have had a handful, maybe not even a handful, probably over the years, of people who do zone changes for one reason or, it's like, oh, well, I'm timber, which is our forest zone. I'm timber, but I want to be ag forest because I want to do agricultural processing, or I want to be ag forest because I want to do a winery, or, there's something they want to have they can't have in timber. So then but then the flip side is I'm ag forest and I can't get a dwelling, therefore I want to be TBR so I can do the template test. I mean, there's definitely this motivation to search for, like people do. So it's just kind of an observation.
Yeah, so what Jennifer is referencing is that you don't need to take an exception to change the designation between forest, farm, and mixed farm forest. You do need to provide findings that the land meets the definition of whatever you're rezoning it to. And it's true that we see a lot of these zone changes for that reason, to take advantage of uses that are allowed in
I had one of those early in my career where they wanted to go from forest to farm so they could build a golf course on the South Coast. Or no, because golf courses aren't allowed in the forest. So yeah.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to go into just a couple of different things. And
Lori, this is Lori again. I guess you can't see me when
sorry,
I raise
Lori.
my hand. That's okay. That's okay. I'm the one interrupting. I know this isn't the issue, and Lane County doesn't have any mixed farm forest zones, but what we have a lot of, and it's manipulated, are mixed zones. In other words, mixed zones that were basically created through property line adjustments. And I don't know if this is a common situation with other counties, but it's quite problematic at times. when you're evaluating something pursuant to one zone, but you have a split zone property that was, created through a property line adjustment. Very few were zoned split zone during comprehensive planning, but we have a lot of them here. Sometimes they're EFU and forest, but most of the time they're the different versions of the zone for the plan designation. And oftentimes it's an undevelopable zone with a forest template zone. And so you have an undevelopable zone that's part of the subject property, and then you have a forest template application for the portion. So how do you lay the template, for example? 160, do you cover just the F2 portion, centered over the center of the F2? Do you center it over the center of the subject property? There's all these issues that come up because of that.
Yeah, and so what Laurie, I think, is alluding to is that the statutory provisions in Division 92 don't prohibit necessarily a property line adjustment that creates a mixed zone parcel. And counties take different approaches. Some don't allow property line adjustments that create split zone parcels, some do. And so there's a variety of approaches across the state to that particular question. Let's go ahead and move on into landfills. So we're going to touch on a couple of issues fairly quickly here that are in the matrix now. And these are issues that have been identified by either working group members or members of the public. So the first one are landfills, and that would be in EFU provisions, a site for the disposal of solid waste approved by the governing body of city or county for which a permit has been granted essentially by the Department of Environmental Quality. And so we understand that the intent behind this was to facilitate the development of landfills on resource lands. But in practice, a variety of other solid waste disposal facilities like waste transfer stations, recycling facilities, material recovery facilities, junkyards, facilities that have a more a different type of impact than landfills that can be more industrial in nature and more intensive than landfills are being permitted under this land use category. Blair, did you want to talk a little bit more about this particular issue as well?
Hillary, I actually think you've completely captured it in your comments in the matrix. There's nothing to add to that. It's very clear.
And the suggestion was that, the commission consider adopting rules to limit that particular use back to landfills.
Historically, this has been an issue many times that, a new statutory use is allowed or added to address a specific situation. And in this case, landfills were related to the, North Willamette Valley. They were having trouble citing a landfill because of NIMBY type stuff, 20, 30 years ago. And so this, this type of provision went in there, but what was lacking was a definition. And, definitions are one of the major issues across the board in the EFU zone. And this is just another one of those terms that needs to be better defined. I'm not saying they don't need to be located on farmland, because sometimes they do. But what was the intent versus what is it being used? And that's definitions are probably the most important part of any land use code, whether it's a local zoning code or state statute or anything in between. And this is a great example of the need to better define this.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments on landfills? All right, then we're going to move into fill.
Oh, jeez. Nobody from Washington County here?
Washington County is not here, so I'm going to read the comment from Matrix. And so this is Washington County's comment on placement of fill. Under what circumstances is temporary storage of fill allowed? Are we referring to that associated with the permitted development? And I think what we're talking about here is not, accessory fill, if you will, but standalone fill. Grading fill agricultural grading fill goes through land use review at Washington County, and we get comments from their soil and water conservation district on whether it is a valid request for agricultural fill and whether the soil being proposed is acceptable. However, for areas that are permitted to be developed into a non-farm use, there are no means to regulate the soil type. And while we don't have a soil and water conservation district involvement, we keep flyers in our offices to contact the agency for advice on fill material being introduced. So I suspect that Washington County has a more developed process for siting of fill on resource lands than many other counties do. So I think the question is and this occurs in other areas of the state, not just in Washington County. And this goes back to that conversation we had last week about human altered, human transported material. That's that low capability class in a soils report. So this is the human transported piece where you're bringing fill into sites. Sometimes it's road spoils, right? And Public Works might be looking to dump some excavation material, and a landowner wants to fill in a wet spot. And I think we're also talking about fill that doesn't trigger a wetlands or floodplain review. So sometimes in flood areas, and I'm curious, Clatsop, if you have this, there'll be landowners or properties that are intentionally filling floodplain to raise structures and buildings outside of floodplain. Or there's actually provisions to allow for animal refuge platforms in floodplains.
But to me, those are structures.
Those are structures, yeah. Do you want to say more about this? Because you
Yeah,
get a lot of
I get a lot of these calls. The North Willamette Valley, so I'm the two places I get the most where this comes into play the most is Washington and Multnomah counties. And usually it's related to some big project within the Silicon Forest, and they need to get rid of a lot of soil. So they're paying a landowner to take that soil. What the landowner does is in order to avoid getting a permit from the county, they'll argue it's agricultural related. And thus most counties that regulate cut and fill and the like exempt agricultural practices. And that's what Washington County used to call us and try to put the burden on us. And I told them, that's your decision. So that's why they're working with the Soil and Water Conservation District now. But having said that, ODA still gets involved because we regulate agricultural practices for water quality purposes through our water quality program. And a lot of these fills are filling in ravines and the like that were areas where water was used. Water would be basically drained to lower areas, and then you fill those in and we have a water quality issue. I think, a legitimate agricultural practice for cultivation and moving soil around is not going to require that amount of soil that we're seeing. I mean, I've seen 5 or 6, at least in the last 10 years, where the landowners arguing that it's a needed agricultural practice to bring all the soil in to make the ground more productive. And I look at the soil survey, and it's class 2 prime soils to start with. Why are you putting that fill on the top of that great soil if it's, to make it a better ag land when it's already great ag land? So it's an area that needs to be reviewed and looked at, especially in areas where there's these large developments. So we're talking about millions of yards of soil being removed. I've got one now in Multnomah County where it is a nursery operator, but he doesn't need, he's already got lots of land or whatever, but he's getting paid by the city of Portland to basically fill in 3 ravines. We've interjected into this, not because it's fill and ag land, but because we're concerned about the water quality of the area associated with an agricultural practice, which we regulate agricultural practices for water quality. And so people, it's kind of like what Jennifer was talking about, shopping around for the right thing, whether they're shopping around for the way that they can bring this fill in without having to get a permit. And I think it's got to be, bottom line, when I've been working with the counties, the first thing I ask them is, what's going on here? And then I say, well, let me look at this. And I come back and I go, in my opinion, that's not a common and accepted agricultural practice in this situation because, it's class 2 prime soil, or it's, they're talking about this crop and it's not going to grow on that kind of fill, or, nurseries don't usually locate on sloped land like this, things like that. But those are the excuses we're hearing for putting fills out there without getting permits. And to Multnomah and Washington County's credit, they've been trying to deal with this, but they're in Washington County especially, but even in Multnomah County, they're up against, what we are with a lot of issues, the Silicon Forest folks that are, have a lot of weight on this thing.
So is this a topic where a guidance document from the agency would facilitate, or is there proposing rulemaking associated?
Well, I think we need there needs to be a little more look into this, because where does fill end and when does it become solid waste? I mean, soil can be a solid waste. They're disposing of something they wanted to get away from one side and putting it somewhere other. And should it be regulated as a fill, or should it now start to be looked at as solid waste disposal, especially when they're getting paid, to take that soil?
So it seems like then maybe there would need to be a rulemaking clarification on when fill is a farm practice, when fill is something else, and when fill is a solid waste disposal, but there's no use category for that.
Yeah, and counties are leery of regulating it when it was related to agriculture because of right to farm and the ability not to regulate a farming practice. And so, again, definitions may be important here.
And I think it's good also to think about, Department of State Lands, and they have, I guess this would have triggered it. They have their wetland land use notifications of when there is I think that's only triggered with a permit review, right? But of how maybe they have some guidance on when they regulate and when farming practices are also exempt with DSL rules. So just a thinking of guidance, like
sure, that's
looping
great.
in Department of State Lands or other agencies that may have that like regulatory authority.
So I'm hearing guidance document coordinated with ODA and DSL.
Yeah, I got to think on this some more, but I mean, it is a real issue, especially in the North Valley. And we're talking millions of cubic yards, not just, an isolated case here or there. And then when you get a legitimate one, I had one in Washington County that was actually a legitimate, they were restoring an agricultural area that had been an industrial site. And the county said, no, this is an industrial site, we're going to make you get and it was actually a legitimate agricultural fill. And so I did go out on that one, take a look at it, talk to the farmer, look over the situation, and I advised Washington County that it was indeed a legitimate agricultural practice and that they should consider that. So, but ODA can't get into the practice of being doing this for every single one without some better definition, I think. So.
Yeah. It sounds like we do some between meeting follow-up on that, then a little bit more thought on it. So the next topic would be a similar sort of question, defining when composting is a farm practice and when it's a commercial use that requires conditional use review. So this came in from a member of the public, and I'm curious, like for the farmers in the group, do you compost as part of your farm operation?
On a very limited basis, but yeah, I think it should be some kind of commercial use if it's not used on that farm. I really think that's where the line should be drawn. If you're selling it, hauling it, then it's a commercial use of some kind.
See,
Kristen or Jackie, do you guys compost on your farms?
Yeah, this is Jackie. I agree with Mike. We don't. We have other, like when we're growing fruit, we have food safety things. So there's other reasons why maybe we wouldn't be composting, just so others understand. But if it's part of a business, I think it would be commercial, but it's not part of our current conventional farm operation.
Christian?
Yeah, I would just like to second what Mike and Jackie said regarding compost. We compost at the farm, but it has nothing to do with the agricultural operations. It's more for the garden, and it's if it was commercial, yeah, I agree with Mike and Jackie.
I live very like a few exits away from the Recology in North Plains, and it's just amazing that those trucks literally go all over the state. So to me, things like that is definitely a commercial activity on that land.
Okay.
So little history on this. This goes back to Ron Eber and I working on, this has been an issue off and on for years. And I don't disagree with the thing that's been said here. I think, but we probably need to look at it just to make sure that it's clear what the break is between what is farm use and what is commercial, because the intent was to do exactly what you were all saying, but it's, I get more, I want to say more, I get a lot of calls on this trying to say, is this a farm use or is this commercial? Do we have to get a permit or not? Is this allowed on high value farmland? Because remember, composting that's not a farm use is not allowed on high value farmland. And that came from a case out of Washington County, Best Buy in town versus, I forget, anyways. These guys were basically bringing yard debris out to an EFU zone property, composting it there, and then shipping it back in at garden centers and the like. It wasn't like they were composting it for use by farmers, which would have still been a commercial use in conjunction with, because they weren't farming themselves. But it came down to, they were looking for flat land close to the city, and it was high value farmland. And so we tried to better define the differences between the two, but we do get quite a few calls on this. And I think if anything, we just need to better look at, make it clear what is what and what is not. You've got to be a little careful here. Remember, the definition of farm use in statute includes the disposal of waste. And so, so the disposal of waste is, whether it's for sale or not, the statute doesn't distinguish about that. So if a farmer's selling waste from his property, is that, and he happened to compost it, is that a farm use and thus allowed, or the like? I would argue that it probably is, but if that farmer is starting to bring in waste from yard debris from places and this and that, and then composting and then turning around and selling it, he's probably, crossed the line in terms of farm use and now started to develop it at a minimum as a commercial use in conjunction with, but at best, or at worst case, compost. And so there's some clarity things there. I mean, we had a situation where this comes up the most in agriculture is with dairies. They do a lot of composting, and they use a lot of their compost right there on the farm for bedding and different things like that. And we had a situation in one dairy where they were bringing in yard debris and the like, but they needed it to supplement to compost the manure. And so they were bringing in yard waste, but they weren't, turning around and shipping it or selling it. And when they did do that, they were actually bringing in manure from the Oregon Zoo and compost and then they were bagging it and selling it. That's where we told them they crossed the line. And at a minimum, if they were selling it to farms, they needed to get a commercial use in conjunction with it. Wasn't just a composting facility, or if they were selling it in cities and the like, it wasn't, it wasn't allowed out there because there was no nexus to farm use. So I think we all know what it should be. The question is it defined the way it should be? So we all know what we want here. We just need to make sure that it's clarified such that it works the way it should.
Right, I think, the definition is very important, and when I think about that a little more, regarding like dairies in Tillamook County or other dairies or feedlots, if it's all produced there but sold off the farm, maybe that's okay. It's when you start hauling in thousands of tons and then hauling out thousands of tons and how you define that. But,
And then there's vermiculture, which is a whole nother ballgame.
Do you get a lot of questions on vermiculture?
It runs hot and cold. There was a time when I'd get a bunch, and lately I haven't gotten any, but there for a while, there was a lot of people talking about vermiculture and worms and composting and the like. And in fact, there was even some statutory changes, remember, several years back. So, yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting topic. And so there's some suggested language change here in the rule. And there are certainly cases, like you said, for dairies that you need to bring in wood chips or other debris to make something that is going to be a quality compost to spread on your fields, right? And the rules do allow for the distribution of that compost to the sale of that compost to farmers in the area.
And one other thing to remember here, when farmers do composting and the like, and do land apply it, it is subject to regulation by ODA, either through a CAFO permit or through water quality, because we are still concerned about what that would do to the water quality of the area's water base. So that is regulated by ODA.
And so, yeah, and a lot of it, so there are some real subtleties depending on the type of agricultural operation that you're talking about with this definition that are maybe worth a little bit more careful consideration.
But yeah, it was and still can be a very big issue. It was basically an urban waste problem being foisted onto rural lands, and that's what really started the whole discussion. Gosh, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. So I'm forgetting the years anymore. I'm getting too old.
Sounds like it maybe comes down to an issue of distinguishing between the types of materials that are imported.
Yeah, I'm we just need to sit down and it'd probably take us an hour or two just to sift through it, look at the words, and where's the. I'd love to have a planner or two from a county that's had to deal with this issue, just to help us better define. And where it really comes up is really people wanting to do things on high value farmland, because the LCDC rules, rightfully so, because we supported that at ODA. We testified on this, and composting facilities on high value farmland should be very careful, because composting is not land dependent. You can compost on asphalt, so it's really important to protect that quality farmland. So.
All right, parks. Oh, I'm sorry, Christian, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I apologize. This is a little out of turn. I had to step away for part of the discussion on mapping, and I just wanted to, I think that's one of the more important subjects that we're covering today. And I just wanted to highlight, emphasize some of the comments that I heard, that I think the mapping is so important and such a valuable tool. And I think I heard Blair saying something about how the counties can't continue to do this on a case-by-case basis. And if we had adequate mapping, not just of the fire zone, but of water resources, this would be so valuable for farmers, for land use advocates. I mean, I think it's just something that we have to have, and to seek the funding for that so that DLCD can do this. And I think Jim Johnson was talking about how NRCS does trainings on this. I just wanted to support that and echo that sentiment.
Thank you. So you're hearing another plug for maintaining a easily accessible repository for critical sort of layers that can be used in land use planning, and DLCD providing more support to the public as well as other jurisdictions on mapping exercises. Okay. So parks. So this is another comment that came in from the public, private parks. And this is one of the uses that we actually missed in our last discussion on multi-path permitting. Parks, private parks, are a sub-T use in farm zones and in forest zones. There are slightly different standards for private parks in forest zones than there are in farm zones. In the Goal 4 rules, they limit recreational activities on forest lands to those that are appropriate for a forest environment. And farm rules don't have that same distinction or a similar distinction. So there is some case law on this topic. So what I just talked about comes from Etsy, which is an older case. And what we see are some interesting things being permitted as private parks. So events, venues, and then sort of intensive recreational uses like volleyball courts and paintball facilities, ropes courses, that sort of thing. There is case law on events in private parks. So that essentially that local events like weddings are not recreational uses that would be permissible in private parks. And there's something there that we could potentially codify. But the suggestion generally was to do a rulemaking to clarify what types of uses are permissible in parks and resource zones. This is another item that Washington County brought up in support of, as well as a member of the public. So any other thoughts on private parks, those who have worked with them or seen them or processed them?
Hey, Jennifer, you want to talk about Lesher Farms?
We don't talk about that right now.
I think it needs to be very limited, and I don't know the wording well enough, but that's something that can really get out of hand very quickly. You know, you could take up 30, 40 acres of some kind of massive private park.
I think it's really important to recognize that these are parks, whether they're public or private, that are on farm zone land. So this is rural. And forest, but I'm you know, it's but I think of a proposal years ago in Hood River County where the Parks District had acquired some land next to an orchard, and they got a grant from state parks without going through a Lux process. And they were told they had to get a permit for this, and the permit was denied ultimately because they were proposing athletic fields, all kinds of different things that were not considered to be dependent on rural land. They were serving an urban need on rural land, and the farmers were really concerned about the impacts to surrounding orchard operations, which were intensive, use pesticides, chemicals, you know, lots of noise. Fans running all the, you know, that type of thing. And what it really came down to is it probably got to be better defined in terms of urban versus rural use. Number one, who's it serving and the like. And don't get me wrong, urban people use rural parks, but they're out there generally in more cases because they want a more rural experience, not because they, you know, they're looking for, you know, the AstroTurf grass soccer field. Which is serving all the people within the city as opposed to the rural population. That's always been, you know, been kind of the real concern. That and the fact that private parks, you listed it. I've seen more things proposed as a private park that most of us would never consider to be a park. It can be more of a commercial use and the like. And so I think we need to look at like some of the terms that were used in the state park master planning statute that's in the EFU zone. Jennifer's doing some of that right now because the city of Lake Oswego is trying to get a master plan for a park that straddles the urban growth boundary. And so there's this conflict between urban use and rural use and what's appropriate and the like. It's a legitimate issue, especially, you know, a lot of farmers will tell me the use that they're most concerned about farming next to is recreational uses. Because people see that park as part of a larger open space area then, and there's trespass issues, there's littering issues, people that are on that land are complaining about the adjacent farming practices. So I think it's really important that we look at that and try to distinguish between rural type land uses that are associated with parks versus urban.
Jackie and then Mike.
So one of what gives me like instant emotion when you say parks makes me think of Metro. So Metro basically says that they're restoring farmland or whatever with some of their rural parks, which it's hurtful to all Oregonians and just the culture when they're doing that, because what they did is Killen Wetlands, for example, they basically impacted the ag infrastructure. So the water, the drainage, the increase of beavers, things like that. So I feel like it is, I understand the intent and how it can serve communities, but I feel like it was not worth disrupting the ag infrastructure to make that choice, that was poor planning. And then the increased traffic and other conflicts that were just mentioned. So my question is, would that situation with the Metro parks be included in this private park conversation? And then when Christian was talking about maps, it reminded me about like the irrigation districts. So if the city, county, state, if the planners would understand that these Bureau of Reclamations, the money, the infrastructure that's all been put into these irrigation systems needs to be protected as a priority. I feel strongly that it should not be negotiable, versus if there's enough money to work around it or reroute something, then it's just, I feel like it's wasting resources and impacting the infrastructure that we've worked so hard to get. So, and that's all.
Thank you, Jackie. I've heard about that particular project, but I wasn't there to experience it.
So yeah, the Killiams Wetlands is a park in name only, because Metro Parks did it. They authorized that as a wetlands. They didn't actually authorize it as a park for any kind of use of the like. That's why I've always argued, and Hillary, this is where I first really got to work with Hillary, is that wetlands need to go through a review process on farmland, because it's not only a conversion issue, loss of farmland, it's also the shadow that's cast on adjacent lands and potential impact, drainage, in the case of coastal salinization of water and the like. So Jackie, that's owned by Metro Parks, but it was actually authorized as a wetlands, and wetlands are sub-1 permitted use in the EFU zone, and that's an issue in and of itself. And Tillamook County's got a process now where wetlands are reviewed. That was a pilot project. Maybe it needs to be extended to to the rest of the state. So that's where that got. I just wanted to add one other thing. Somebody said farm and forest, and that reminded me. Forest land has that provision about parks appropriate for forest environment. We need something like that in the ag zone. Parks that are appropriate for the agricultural environment. So.
Yes, I agree with that. Earlier.
I did, but I'm fine. I'm put myself on mute.
Okay, Mike?
Well, I think you clearly have to make a distinction between private parks and public parks. But Jim mentioned the one in Hood River County, which was a public park. And I understand that even on high value, it's an allowed use if you have an approved master plan. And I'm not sure that's a very good criteria. And I actually got on the Parks Board and served on the Parks Board, partly in an effort to get that piece of high value land sold. So it would go back into agriculture, which it still belongs to the Parks District. But in the meantime, we did purchase 20-acre park inside UGA. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, there is land almost always available for parks. It's just more expensive. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why it's chosen. And I don't believe that's an appropriate reason to go on to ag land. Then that public park became a model aircraft field. And I think there should be some regulation about that personally. And it actually became quite a difficult issue for the neighbor because they would fly over her house all the time and she complained and nothing was ever done about it. But they're very noisy in some cases, and it was a real serious issue to the neighbors. So.
And to build onto this really brings up one of the issues for more than just parks, but for a lot of non-farm uses. The review criteria for a lot of non-farm uses in the EFU zone do not take into account conversion, the loss of farmland. It's only about the farm impacts test and whether it will adversely impact or that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And some of these uses should, if it's marginal land or something, okay, maybe that's an appropriate place for a park, in a farm zone, but maybe not. But in the case that Mike's talking about, it's high value farmland surrounded on 3 sides by orchards. That's a lot. That's not just a compatibility issue. That's a loss of land. And maybe we need to be looking at some more limitations on what kind of things at a minimum cannot be allowed on high value farmland, for example. Which this is. This is a high value farmland chunk of land, kind of thing. So because parks are not soil dependent, they are land dependent, but they've got some options that agriculture doesn't have.
Mm-hmm. Right. And again, that urban rural issue as well about the intensity of park development that has been coming up on occasion.
Jennifer's got the great case, I'll tell you.
Jennifer, you don't have to say anything, but if you would like to throw in your 2 cents, we'd love to hear from you.
And get them off my back, Jennifer.
oh, don't worry. They'll all be calling me soon because I'm sure they'll be filing their application. Okay. I don't know what I have to add. I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about, not in this group necessarily, but certainly the rules about park planning in general could need to be clarified just because it's very circuitous to even figure out what the sort of roadmap is for local governments for public parks. Clackamas County, we actually adopted a definition of private park, which I can't quote you off the top of my head. That was something that I think our planning commission back in the day thought was a good idea. And I think it does effectively narrow quite a bit the scope of what you can do as a private park. For the public park piece, I think this urban rural question is a good one. I think Lesher Farm, when they do file their master plan, that's going to be an issue. And then the other piece is that the park rules really speak to what I would describe as the physical infrastructure at a park. Can you have open play fields as opposed to, you know, active like sport courts? Can you have, you know, yurts? Can you, I mean, what are the sort of physical things you can have at a park? Doesn't do a very good job of talking about the uses that you can have at a park. And I think that's going to be the sort of the use of that infrastructure. And I think with Lesher Farm, that is going to be a big issue for the community. So it's, can I have 5K fun runs? Can I have camps and classes for kids? Do those have to, is it different if they're farming classes? Because that's what Lesher Farm is to some extent doing. So those things are really not addressed. And I think we are going to have to make findings for that very specifically for this particular master plan when the time comes.
For those of you that don't know, Lesher Farm straddles the urban growth boundary, so it's partially in the UGB and a lot outside the UGB, so.
All right, well, it looks like Clatsop has a definition for private park as well. So the good examples to look at. So the Division 34 rules are complicated. It was a rulemaking that was done for OPRD, and then counties were added into it, piggybacked onto it at the very last minute in that rulemaking, which explains some of the structure of those rules. But yeah, as Jennifer said, well, the infrastructure that's allowed to be developed is discussed in those rules, like the uses, like these event type uses that are coming up are not sort of addressed or contemplated in rules. Claire?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what everybody else is saying pretty much, which is I think that that the rules outside of LCDC's rules deal with issues that are particular to parks, but they're not thinking about the park's impact or appropriate location within a farm or forest zone. So that's really up to these rules to do a better job of that. And I would also echo, I don't see how private parks are any different than, you know, golf courses and all these other non-farm uses and schools that are no longer allowed on high value farmland just because there's such a limited supply of high value farmland. And it's like, do we really need to put another park there? You know, isn't really, you know, I think it's a valid question, but it just doesn't seem like it should be a directly allowed use or even conditional use, maybe an exception if you can't get it somewhere else. So for all of these issues, if we're going to do the cumulative impacts analysis, it's so difficult, so challenging that I'm just skeptical that we'll ever really do the job that we need to do. So I think on these uses where we know there's a cumulative impact of non-farm uses, that we just say no more on high value farmland.
So we're getting close to the end of our meeting time. I did want to bring up goal 5, the interesting intersection between goals 3, 4, and 5. There have been some cases that's coming out of Lane County lately. Not talking about the clear and objective standards cases, and talking about the ones that circle around the county's habitat density overlay. Essentially, or how the county has approached the habitat density overlay. They're called King, Nimkish, and Hendrickson. And they're really good examples of how many counties relied on protections provided by goals 4 particularly to also protect habitat values. So some counties don't have any habitat overlays at all, and they rely on the minimum parcel size standards for forest zones essentially to protect habitat values. And when Goal 5 elements were adopted, there were far fewer uses permitted in forest zones and in farm zones than there are now. So one of the questions that comes up, not necessarily in this case, is, is that sort of theory still hold today, that the protections afforded by farm and forest zoning sort of serve to protect habitat? Joy, do you want to say anything else on that topic?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think you set it up right. Yeah, so for ODFW, we are non-regulatory, so we really do rely on the land use program, and that is like back in our state agency coordination and our land use planning, and we rely on that. And back in the day when these plans were getting developed, a lot of the old comprehensive plan language, it specifically says because this is farm and forest land, it protects wildlife habitat. So, and we rely on those zonings. And even though there may be for example, like a big game overlay that's been adopted, those maps were adopted usually in plan acknowledgement. So late 80s, early 90s, maybe. And they have not been updated since. So we really do rely on those large parcel sizes for habitat connectivity, for minimizing indirect impacts of noise and just fragmentation. So we see that a lot, and obviously on forest land, there is the nexus in the definition of forest land. So when there's exceptions or projects, we can lean on that, which we don't have with Goal 3. But Goal 3 still does have lot sizes and measures that minimize fragmentation of agricultural land that we also rely on for habitat. So yeah, how to just kind of emphasize the that reliance, on Goal 5 with the values of farm and forest land, working landscapes, connectivity of working lands. I think it's just emphasizing that is still really important to acknowledge, and how to emphasize that relationship of, wildlife habitat, which includes aquatic resources, as well as the benefits of ag and forest land. Yeah.
So it kind of goes back a little bit to the conversation we're having earlier today about articulating the benefits of the farm and forest program, beyond their intended purpose. So even while we're protecting farmland and forest land for, in support of the agriculture and timber economies, by doing so, you're also, saving that land for sequestration practices, and that land also has value for habitat. And so articulating these co-benefits, I think is really important. And as lands are approved for, exceptions or other conversions, or as new uses are added to farm and forest zones, as the regulatory structure of the Goal 3 or Goal 4 program has been adapted by the legislature or our commission over time, those benefits that the program has to other uses like habitat aren't necessarily part of the equation, because that's not their focus, right? That's not their primary intent. And so where counties or other agencies rely on those programs to accomplish certain goals that aren't sort of express purpose or express focus of Goal 3 or Goal 4, there are problems.
Just to build on that, Hillary, the calls that I get, either from my colleagues at another state agency or from some local governments or from activists as it relates to wildlife and agricultural practices and the like, a lot of times people are calling me up and saying, this is farmland, we're afraid about wildlife habitat out here. Farmland is better for wildlife habitat than a solar facility. So I guess what I'm getting at is minimum lot sizes and the like are good as far as they go, but when you start to look at large footprint non-farm uses, they're not being protected, the wildlife habitat is not being protected by the EFU zone. So you've got nexus to goal 5 still needs to be there. And that's why I was talking earlier about updating inventories to have those. And then there's the cumulative impact of non-farm dwellings. When I worked as a county planner, there was I remember the local ODF and W folks talking about nothing worse for winter range habitat than 40 non-farm dwellings out here. They put up fences that are not friendly to wildlife. They make a lot of noise. There's more traffic, on and on and on. And so it's the cumulative impact issue that we've talked about again before. But again, it may be the worst farmland in the world out there. So you could put 40 non-farm dwellings out there, and the EFU zone's not protecting the wildlife habitat. So I think as far as it goes, yes, farm and forest land zoning does a better job than most other zones for protecting wildlife habitat. But in certain instances, certain land uses, you need that goal 5 addition because farm and forest land isn't going to do it.
So how do you put
Lori's
that
got
in
it.
the process? How do you put that in the process?
You update goal 5. We recommend that or something.
So in the matrix, and then Lori, I'll just take this. In the matrix, you sort of identified a couple actions. You identified collaboration between the goal 5 specialist, myself, and Jory on a white paper to articulate this issue better and some of the history. And that white paper could be included in the next biennial Farm and Forage report to the Commission, which is next year. We also looked at some data analyses that we could collaborate on, sort of looking at the overlay of important wildlife resources with zoning protections to define how much of ODFW priority areas are actually on resource lands. And then the second layer is that cumulative impacts analysis, whether it's dwellings or other types of non-resource related developments, and where those fall relative to lands protected under farm and forest zoning and ODFW's priority areas to look at that nexus visually a little bit more, spatially a little bit more. But again, that would be a large mapping effort as well. So those are on the matrices. Lori, did you have
Yes, thank you. So these cases that we brought in the forest zone were based on our ability to trigger the applicability of the comprehensive plan, where the density standards are. And the density standards in our comprehensive plan aren't specific to farm or forest land. And the density standards come from ODF and W. But we can't apply them in the farm zone because the language in ORS 215, the 700 series that relied on, that include, I'm paraphrasing, but it basically establishes the applicability of provisions of the comprehensive plan. That same language doesn't exist in 215, 213. And so we have no way. It seems to me that there needs to be either a rule change or a statutory update, because the language about applicability of the comprehensive plan for some reason is in the 215 700 series. I'm sorry, I refer to the forest land rules that way. I mean statutes that way, but I do. But there's just not as many in the 700 series as in 215 213 or 215 284. But that's what's missing. That is the link that's missing.
Claire, did you want to say something about the Hendrickson interpretation of Brentmar?
I do, because first I just want to say,
can I just say one thing real quick about Hendrickson?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't deer winter range. It was major big game. Lane County doesn't protect deer winter range. It's not a protected Goal 5 resource. Hendrickson was about major big game. It could have been about peripheral. I don't remember exactly, but it wasn't about deer or winter range.
We only have one range.
So what I wanted to add was, so I mean, we don't really have to reinvent the wheel. What's interesting is that, I mean, during acknowledgement, ODFW did have density recommendations that were put in local comprehensive plans. And what was weird about Hendrickson, I think Luba got it wrong. They said counties cannot be more restrictive than state law in EFU zones. We've heard that a million times, right? That's the Brent Moore case. But they misinterpreted what the criteria was. It wasn't a local criterion, it was an implementation of state criteria, of Goal 5 criteria. So going forward, I just think that can be, and so they said if LCDC wants to adopt a rule to clarify that they apply, they can do it. So let's do it. I think it already did. I think they got it wrong, but that's something you can do in your own rule. Lubin invited you to do it. And these other issues, I think, I understand, I haven't read it all, but that ODFW has so much more mapping now than they had during acknowledgement. I just think it's like, I don't think we need to sit down and talk about it a lot. It's like, let's get that, again, let's get periodic review funded. Let's get these maps and the comprehensive plans and have the density regulations around them that can be applied by counties. We just need to move forward on that. I hate to talk about it for 5 years. It's just because the data is there. They've done a great job. So whatever we can do to help facilitate that would be great.
Yeah, I think that's thank you for that. We just released priority wildlife connectivity area maps, and those are areas of that we identified where areas could be restored, just protected or enhanced, so opportunities for enhancement. But I think it's, as ODFW really does rely on the land use planning program, especially resource lands. And a lot of what we do is so reactive. So how to get these maps, which are meant to be proactive and help identify where these resources are similar, how can the public use them? How can they be adopted into processes? So just whatever we could do to help support that, which also is supporting resource land protection, which we rely on. So many interesting conversations. All right, so it's about time to talk about next steps and wrap up. We have covered such a huge variety of issues over the past 2 months. I was actually working on consolidating the matrices last night, and this group has identified just under 70 individual actions for consideration, which is great. That's a lot to think about. It's a lot to work on. These sections have just been so interesting, and I'm so impressed with the deep knowledge and history that everybody on this group has. I feel lucky to be able to take advantage of all the feedback. So before I get into next steps, I just want to check in with the group on the issues that we've covered and where we are right now. And I just want to ask everybody, there's a couple of things that we haven't gotten to, I know, but are there super important issues related to an improvement of the technical performance, the Goal 3-4 program that we have not touched on yet, or you have not seen a matrix, or do we feel like we've covered most everything so far? Lori?
I just have one thing. You may have covered it. I haven't been here the whole time. This is something that the attorney we work with asked me to bring up, Sean Malone. We run into problems a lot with replacement dwellings because the language in the rule doesn't say that the dwelling to be replaced has to be lawfully established. And we have a lot of unlawfully sited dwellings. And so how has this been discussed? Where the word lawful is missing for something that's existing, that it should actually be inserted.
So in 215-291, that's what you're asking about.
So that's for the EFU zone, right?
Yes.
So 215-755 would be for the forest zone. Correct.
So that does require that the dwelling be lawfully established.
Not in the forest zone, does it?
So it will in January.
Okay.
Yeah. And we did have some discussion about LCDC interpretation of what lawfully established means. And so that is in the matrix. So yeah, so it's been kind of fun to work with a moving target on the replacement dwelling staff and the new standards that are going to be coming into effect in January on that. Claire?
Yes, this is an issue that we should have raised earlier, but it just was brought to my attention by a member. The definition for and criteria for non-farm dwelling in the non-farm dwellings in the Willamette Valley reference class, I think it's 6 through 8 soil, maybe it's, and maybe 5 through 8. Maybe it's 4 through 8. I'm trying to look at it. Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, it includes high value farmland. So you get sort of an ironic situation where you're having them approved in high value farmland, even though it's the lower productivity soils. I think the rules could address that.
Okay. Is there anything else, or do people feel like we've covered most of the issues? I'm asking because we do have one more meeting on the books for the end of January, and I am wondering if maybe to push that out a week and talk about the report.
November 29th. Not the end of June.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I'm going forward to we have a meeting tentatively scheduled for the 29th, and I'm wondering if folks feel that there are more issues that we need to sort of discuss or talk about at that meeting, or if we should move into or another meeting to review the report or comments on the report, maybe a little bit later, the first week of December or so. So let's kind of get a feeling from the group if we've covered most of the ground.
I think we've
covered a lot of ground.
So you're writing a full report though?
I am.
And that will be done before the 29th. And I'm not trying to push you because I know it's going to be a big report, but
yeah.
Would we have that available to study before the 29th?
So that's why I'm thinking of pushing it out a week, so that we can talk about comments on the report.
That's a good idea. So
I think that's a good idea too. Just more time to Karen respond.
So then I'll do a survey.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's a good week for me. The only the 6th is bad for me.
Okay, great. So as far as next steps, yeah, we have covered a lot of ground. And what I would like you to do, you've given so much to this process already, but I have taken all of these ideas and put them in a consolidated matrix. And what I'd ask you to do is revisit the ranking exercise. Now that we've had the opportunity to discuss all of these issues, the history and context behind them, and we thought about ways to address them. And we've also added some topics into this conversation. So tomorrow I'm going to send out that combined matrix with each individual action item that we've talked about. So they're going to be about 70 items on it. And each individual action has its own line items. So for certain topics or statements of need, there are going to be multiple of those action items with the sort of same statement of need. And I'd ask you to rank them with directions this time. So considering complexity and ease of implementation, and to ask you to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being big impact on the program and low complexity for solution. A 10 would be a low impact on the program and a really complex solution. A 5 would be something that is easy to implement with a lower impact, or something that would be complex to implement but would have a really big impact. So I think it would be great to have each one of you go through the final-ish matrix and just rank all of those on that scale. to get a better sense of, some priorities of all of those. Any questions on that idea or thoughts or feedback on it? Oh. Okay.
Well,
So
Hillary, one more. I mean, could there also be, or just maybe just notes next to it? You said impact and then complexity, but I think there's also a question of urgency. I think, some things may be a little more urgent than others, and so just they kind of move up because of that. And you may not agree with that, but it just strikes me that might be a possibility.
Yeah, I think that is, something that's urgent is going to definitely have a bigger impact if we address it. So something that needs to be implemented sooner than later in order to, stop a pattern that we're seeing, for example, that would be something that has a big impact on the program. So I'd consider urgency along with that sort of impact to the program. So expect that tomorrow, and let me know if you have any questions on it. I am actually going to be out of the office between November 10th and the 24th. So if you have thoughts or comments to me before the 10th, that would be really great. If you are going to try to reach out to me between the 10th and the 24th, I won't respond, but I'll be thinking of you.
Sure you will.
And ready to get back into things when I get back after Thanksgiving. So next steps are ranking of the matrices, and then I'm taking this whole process, writing a summary and describing all of these issues in what's called the summary report. So I'd love your thoughts on that report when we have it in draft form. Again, that should be coming out towards the end of November, early December, and that report will go out for public comment in December. So there'll be an announcement on our GovDelivery channel. That report will be posted to the project webpage, and then public comment sort of received during December is going to be integrated into the staff report for commission the January commission meeting where this will be presented to LCDC. I also anticipate that there'll be public comment submitted to LCDC on the report through the normal commission channel and public comment at the commission meeting in January as well. Any other questions on next steps or moving forward? It is, and I can't remember it off the top of my head right now, but I will forward that out tomorrow along with my sort of recap for the discussion.
This is Angela. I just want to say I will get the survey for the moving the meeting out to you guys tomorrow. Should be by the afternoon, so check your emails and reply to the email as your availabilities for moving the 29th meeting out to roughly the first week of December.
So Blair has a good question. When is the commission meeting in
I'm
June?
looking.
Because I got my Band and Dunes golf time.
Oh, no. It is January 24th to the 25th, 26th.
That's the worst time.
And just for folks, Sarah dropped a comment in there. In the first matrix, you saw that there was a column for 4956 implications. And so that will be back in the matrix this time around. So if any of these ideas would trigger measure 56, which requires noticing to all potentially impacted landowners, or 49, which would allow them to file a claim for compensation or for reversionary development rights. We want to note that as part of the reporting process as well. Having just been through the House Bill 2225 measure 56 process, it's a pretty big deal. All right. And again, as soon as I know what our agenda item is going to be for that meeting, I'll let folks know as well. Well, thank you all, and thank you for staying past time as well. I really appreciate, again, the time and effort you devoted to the project. I'm so thankful for all your feedback. I hope you'll have a great weekend, and we'll see you later.